All right, so the agricultural revolution, also called the Neolithic Revolution, began for several reasons. Of course, there were climatic shifts. The last Pleistocene, the last ice age, ended approximately 10 to 11,000 years before present. So obviously, as we come out of an ice age, the climate is becoming warmer and more stable. So, during these glaciation periods, the climate was not only colder, but it was also less predictable. There was a lot more periods of, especially as we're coming out of it, a lot more periods of extreme cold, and that would warm up for a little bit and then go back to extreme cold. So obviously that was, it was stressful on organisms, not just hominins, but also the organisms that we relied upon for hunting and gathering. So the climate became warmer and more stable. Also, along with this, as the ice began to melt, carbon dioxide levels rose, which allowed for increased plant productivity. So essentially allowed the possibility for humans to be able to cultivate plants and control their growth cycles. So a little bit of bio, if anybody's taken bio, has probably studied photosynthesis. So with photosynthesis, plants need to take in carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight to engage in photosynthesis, and they release oxygen for us. But essentially coming out of the ice age, not only allowed for a warmer climate, but a climate that was adequate and ideal for cultivating plants. So this revolution, the agricultural or Neolithic revolution, is considered to be a fundamental threshold in the evolution of humans, because we see some key changes. And, when you think about it, 10,000 years really isn't that long in evolutionary terms. The planet itself has been around 4.6 billion years. Hominins, human ancestors, have been around about 6 million years. The genus Homo has been around about 2 million years. Homo sapiens have been around about 300,000 years. But we've only been practicing agriculture for about 10,000. So really just a blip in time in evolutionary terms. So of course, as paleoanthropologists, as historians, as anthropologists, we want to understand why. Why did humans decide to essentially abandon nomadic hunting and gathering in favor of sedentary agricultural methods of acquiring food? So of course, environmental and climatic fluctuations were likely an influencer, because it allowed for an environment that was, that was capable of supporting intensified agriculture. Also increases in human population size. Hunter-gatherers tend to live in smaller population densities because they're constantly moving. It's not advantageous for them to have, groups of, several hundred individuals and have a whole lot of property that they're carrying around with them. So essentially, when we're nomadic hunter-gatherers, there really wasn't a situation where population size was exploding. And as we know, once population size explodes, there's also other pressures that come along with that. A larger population size means that we need a more stable and reliable food source. It means that humans are going to start competing over both land and resources. It means that not all land is going to be created equal, because obviously some land is closer to water, some land is more fertile and has better nutrients for agriculture. So humans are going to naturally compete over those pieces of land that are more ideal for what they want, essentially. All right, so during the early Holocene, so the Holocene just simply refers to the last 10,000 years. During the early Holocene, humans are still largely and mainly nomadic. So just like the transition from quadrupedalism to bipedalism didn't happen overnight, just like human brain size didn't, grow exponentially overnight, or even with a few generations, this transition did take place somewhat gradually. So in the beginning of the Holocene, humans are still moving seasonally, and they're following the migration patterns of the game, essentially the animals that they're hunting. Okay, so just like we talked about before, they're engaging in persistence hunting, but they're also still relying pretty heavily on gathering. And of course, we're coming out of the Pleistocene, we're coming out of the Ice Age. So plant resources, tubers, fruit is all going to be more readily available depending on the region that they're in. They're not having to rely just exclusively on game animals. They're also able to gather and rely upon plant material. But as we move in to the Neolithic period, we begin to see evidence for year-round occupation of villages. So the Neolithic revolution may not have been a sudden or dramatic transition. This transition from hunting and gathering and a nomadic lifestyle to a sedentary agricultural one likely took thousands of years. Okay, so it's a gradual transition, even though sometimes the word revolution might us think that it was sudden or dramatic and took place relatively rapidly, not necessarily the case. So even though this term revolution exists, when we're referring to this, just keep in mind that this transition took place gradually. All right, so let's talk about the positives and the negatives, the pros and the cons. So this slide sometimes surprises students because you don't necessarily, before taking a class like this, you don't necessarily think about the possibility that agriculture could be negative in any way, because in modern day, it seems like it's only positive. It's providing us, increased access to food surplus, a more reliable food source. It's feeding our population. So sometimes it's difficult to think about agriculture having any sort of negative connotation. But what we're looking at here, when I say positive and negative, we're looking at the grand scheme of things, the grand scheme of evolution. Because there are some theorists that think that this transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture was actually the worst mistake that humans ever made. Because essentially some negative things have happened. The population has exploded. Along with that, there's been increased competition for resources as we begin to exceed the carrying capacity of our environment. The carrying capacity, thinking back to, again, way back to the beginning of the class, carrying capacity is essentially how many organisms can one ecosystem support without individuals dying, without there being so much competition that some individuals don't have enough food for survival. So, the planet has a population today of over 8.5 billion, and it's growing very rapidly. And I think we can all agree that, maybe not in every place on the globe, but certainly in many places on the globe, we have certainly exceeded the carrying capacity, and that there are individuals out there that don't have enough food to eat, unfortunately. So that could certainly be looked at as a negative consequence. So the positives, of course, reliable food source, a food surplus, a more sedentary lifestyle. Now, that doesn't mean that they were sitting around, watching TV all day. It just means that in comparison to their nomadic lifestyle, where they were traveling 7-8 miles a day just to gather enough food for survival, it was more sedentary in comparison to that. That doesn't mean that they weren't, engaging in quite a bit of, hard labor as they were cultivating plants and animals. It just means that their lifestyle is more sedentary, more stationary than it was in comparison to hunter-gatherers. So along with this, they were able to shorten their birth intervals. So that's another term that we've talked about many times in this class. So birth interval just simply means the amount of time between birth A, birth B, birth C, birth D, so on and so forth. So when we're hunting and gathering, if you recall to this discussion with the human adaptation chapter, if you're hunting and gathering, traveling 7-8 miles a day to gather food, it's not necessarily advantageous to have a child every year or every 2 years, even every 3 years, because our children are born extremely dependent upon us for survival. And we practice on-demand breastfeeding, especially those living in hunting and gathering populations. The first 4 to 5 years of life, the most quality nutrition, the easiest way they can feed their children is to rely on breastfeeding the first 4 to 5 years of life. But, as one of the negatives of this, it does create quite a bit of caloric demands for the mother, because she's not only supporting the calories that her own body needs, she needs to support the calories that a growing offspring needs in her womb, or a growing offspring the first 5 years of life. Okay, so that's her caloric demands are much higher than a male would be, for example, because she's supporting her needs as well as her offspring. So for hunter-gatherers, it's advantageous to space out their births 4 to 5 years. They don't want to have another child until they're completely done breastfeeding the first one. And it also could need more leisure. Sorry about my dog. All right, so another positive could be more leisure time. So along with sedentism, they all of a sudden have more time to engage in things like symbolic expression. So you see more examples of cave art, of statuettes, of pottery, of all sorts of forms of art. So those could all be considered positive consequences of this transition to agriculture. Now the negatives, which I kind of already touched upon, but the negatives would be population increase, but to the extreme. Now in the beginning, of course, population size increase wasn't a huge deal. because we've gone from a population of, hundreds of thousands to over 8.5 billion. So the population increase certainly became an issue, I'd say, over the last 200 years, really. So once the Industrial Revolution took place, that's when we started to really exceed the carrying capacity. Sanitation issues. Now, this is another one that sometimes surprises students, because when you think about it, when you're hunting and gathering, if you need to use the restroom, no big deal. You just use the restroom and keep moving. But as they're living in these sedentary villages, especially in the beginning when they hadn't quite figured it out yet, they're all of a sudden having to deal with, okay, what do we do with human waste and what do we do with animal waste? So that in the beginning, that created some sanitation issues, and we see an uptick in infectious diseases. Also nutritional issues. So, when we're hunting and gathering, our diet is pretty varied. We're consuming a wide variety of plants, tubers, nuts, meat, fruit. We're basically very omnivorous, opportunistic feeders. We're consuming anything that we possibly can. But when we transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture, we're focusing in, at least those early agriculturalists are focusing in on carbohydrates. So they're focusing in on wheat, barley, rice, depending on what region they're in. But generally, the biggest problem, the biggest nutritional issues that we see early on are because these early agriculturalists are focusing too intensely on carbs. So they're missing a key element or key elements of their nutritional needs. Social inequality, that's also one that doesn't necessarily, always seem obvious if you're looking at this transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture. But social inequality, according to some theorists, originated when we transitioned to a more sedentary lifestyle, because all of a sudden we're competing over access to land, access to territory, and we're starting to acquire property. So along with this, as we're living in more sedentary villages, that's when we start to see the differences between the haves and the have-nots, because those that have higher prestige, higher status, will have more access to resources. They will have access to the highest quality land, the highest quality food. They will have access to essentially the things that the low status individuals will not. So, the reason for this argument is, when you look at modern day hunter-gatherers, they're relatively egalitarian. I'm not saying it's 100% egalitarian, certainly not. We don't even see 100% egalitarianism in primates and non-human primates. But certainly ethnographic studies of hunter-gatherers show their social structure is far more egalitarian than ours is, than a state level society is. So that's actually a big topic for your online discussion this week. Your online discussion, you will be watching just one episode of Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, which is actually, it was a book and it was adapted into a documentary series. So that will look more heavily, more intensely at this hypothesis that the origins of inequality began around this time. Now, and it's important to remember, I don't think Jared Diamond is trying to say that explains all inequality. That's certainly not what he's trying to say. What he's looking for is the origins of inequality. Now, of course, there's been all sorts of historical, cultural, and social events that have happened since then that continue to contribute to inequality. So just, I just caution you to not think that he's trying to say that it's explaining all inequality. He's just looking for the origin of inequality here. Okay. Questions so far? Sorry about my dog. I'm trying to get her to be quiet. You guys doing okay? All right. Okay, so social complex. Oh, what in the world happened? That was weird. I skipped to the end somehow. Hold on. Let me get back to where we're at. I don't know who did that. Okay, so let's go back here. So we're on this one. Okay, social complexity. So now I want you to envision it. We're beginning to live in sedentary villages. We're beginning to acquire property. We're beginning to acquire land. We're beginning to compete with one another. We're beginning to form alliances and trade networks with one another. We're beginning to have time to engage in symbolic expression and art. We're no longer spending, most of our waking hours just trying to survive. We're transitioning to this time where we have time for other things. We have time to engage in art, literature, politics, so on and so forth. So we know that complex societies do not develop in isolation, they emerge as networks. So as we're thinking about this time, we know that it, inevitably required more complex social organization. So, again, kind of looking at the origins of the differences between the classes, the haves and the have-nots. Likely during this time, we see the emergence of leaders, or what you might see called in the reading as aggrandizers. We are seeing the origins of inequality and property ownership. We're seeing evidence for intergroup conflict over both land and resources. And the archaeological record, I'll show you some evidence later on in this lecture, but the conflict would sometimes escalate into warfare. So we see a lot of evidence for conflict between groups, sometimes intense conflict, and likely this is due to competition for both land and resources. So we also see alliance formations and trade networks emerging. We see craft specialization, and we see increasing examples of symbolic expression in the form of cave paintings and cave art, statuettes, things like that. Now, it's not that we didn't see this before. We see cave art dating back as long as 50,000 years ago. But it's just saying that around this time, we start to see more examples and more evidence that humans are starting to have the time to engage in behaviors other than just pure survival, okay? So they suddenly have time to engage in things that are more leisurely. All right, so just to show you some examples of that. So I'll show you what I mean by cave art, essentially. So we see cave art in Europe and Africa dating back about 30,000 to 40,000 years before present. So this is pre-Neolithic revolution, of course, that humans are still largely nomadic hunting and gathering during this time. So we see essentially like this painting here on the right, we see depictions of animals and weapons. So generally the biggest interpretation is that they were trying to create a successful hunt, because humans living around this time it's still the Pleistocene, it's still the Ice Age. So they're engaging in hunting, and they're really dependent upon hunting for survival. Now we see cave art in Australia going back as late as 30,000, or as early, I should say, 30,000 to 50,000 years before present. But the cave art is a bit different. The cave art that we see in Australia is a bit different. We see stick figure drawings of these kind of anthropomorphic figurines that are kind of part animal and part human. And this is considered to be what we know as the dreaming time. We know from studies of modern Aboriginal populations, the modern Australian Aborigines, that this art represents a time called the dreaming time. So the dreaming time is a primordial time when the world was first being formed. So the spirits alive during the dreaming created features of the landscape and human beings, and it taught people important elements of their culture and beliefs. So those who believe in these types of religions typically believe that their ancestors created everything around them, the mountains, the streams, the valleys, everything, every environmental catastrophe like volcanoes, earthquakes, floods. It's a belief that our ancestors influenced all of the natural elements of the world around us. And when you think about that, that really creates an ultimate respect for everything around you. If you quite literally believe that your ancestors created everything that's around you, and your ancestors then become a part of everything that's around you once they go, it provides an ultimate respect for everything around you, because simply by destroying the environment around you, you're also destroying what your ancestors left for you. So, these are just the reason I'm showing you these slides in relation to this topic is I just want you guys to kind of have an idea of what I mean when I say cave art and cave drawings. Here's some more examples. This is Chauvet Cave in France. So this cave dates to about 32 to 30,000 years before present. So here again, we're seeing mainly animals being depicted. So, we're likely looking at, cave art having the purpose of inspiring a successful hunt, or as a good luck omen to inspire a successful hunt. And there's a Hall of Bulls. This is Lossix Cave in France, dating about 12,000 to 17,000 years before present. Another picture of the Hall of Bulls, Lossix Cave, France. Venus figurines, these are another form of art that we start to see emerging. So Venus sculptures, they go back as late as 30,000 years before present. So we're not talking strictly about the Neolithic here. But these figurines have been interpreted in many different ways, and it was touched upon a bit in the last documentary you watched, so the First Peoples documentary that you watched for your discussion last week. The Venus figurine topic did come up a bit. They talked about the lion figure of Hohensfeld and the Willendorf figurine, I believe. So it's interesting because we see these figurines popping up in many different regions around the old world. And it's interesting that they have similar depictions. So even though they're popping up in these, regional areas that are not necessarily close to one another, they're still depicting a similar female form, I should say. So they've been interpreted in many ways. Some assume that they depict pregnant women, or they're basically a figurine to promote fertility. They've been suggested to be erotic representations, so prehistoric porn, I guess, or possibly even self-portraits. So, the interpretation is up for debate, of course, but it is interesting that we see these Venus figurines popping up in multiple regions around the old world, and they're of similar bodily form. Okay. There's some more examples of Venus figurines. There's the Venus of Willendorf. That one's a really famous one, and the Venus of Brassenpoy, excuse me. These are Neolithic plastered skulls from Jericho. So these are actually human skulls that they put plaster around, and they use shell beads to cover up the eyes. And this is pottery. So this is obviously not a particularly, beautiful piece of pottery, but it serves a function. So the function of pottery is something that is tied to agriculture, because with agriculture, we need a way to keep the grain dry. So once we have this food surplus, once we've created a lot of grain, we have to have a way to keep it dry. So the pottery was likely used, the pottery actually had a functional reason. There was a functional reason for this pottery. It allowed them to obviously transport water from one location to another, and it allowed them to store grain and keep it dry so that it could be used as a food surplus, essentially. All right, questions so far about anything we've talked about? Feeling good? Okay. All right, so of course, like I touched upon a little bit earlier in this lecture, we as paleoanthropologists, as historians, as anthropologists, we want to understand essentially why did humans make this choice? Just like we wanted to understand why did humans transition from an arboreal quadrupedal lifestyle into a bipedal terrestrial one. We want to understand why humans decided to go from nomadic hunting and gathering to a more sedentary agricultural lifestyle. So there's two scenarios that are out there. Scenario one, essentially large population size came first. And scenario two is essentially the opposite, that agriculture came first and large population size came much later. Now, in my humble opinion, I feel like scenario two has more support and just makes more logical sense. But I'll tell you about both scenarios. And of course, it's certainly possible that both scenarios are a little bit correct, or that there's a combination of both of these scenarios depending upon the region. So scenario one basically states that large population size created the need for human groups to intensify their subsistence strategies in order to survive. Okay. So, and this also stated that essentially human populations had the necessity of creating a larger food surplus and creating food storage for times of shortages. So scenario one is basically stating that large population size created the need or created the necessity of intensifying our subsistence, that we couldn't continue to rely on hunting and gathering, because if we did, we wouldn't be able to support the large population size, or a growing population size, I should say. And then scenario two is essentially the opposite, which to me, scenario two makes a lot more sense. So it's, essentially stating once we transitioned from hunting and gathering to a more sedentary lifestyle, and once we had a reliable food source and the ability to create a food surplus, we were able to shorten our birth intervals. So females, because they didn't have these, really debilitating demands on them, energetic demands of traveling 7-8 miles a day to gather food and practicing on-demand breastfeeding, they essentially reduced the demands on women, so they were able to shorten their birth intervals. Not that they weren't still practicing on-demand breastfeeding, they were, it's just that they didn't have the added stress of also traveling 7-8 miles a day to gather food. They were able to be more sedentary. So it shortened the birth interval. So instead of 4 or 5 years in between a birth, we now look at 2 or 3 years in between births. So the shortened birth interval means that over the reproductive cycle, the female may have double the amount of children that she would otherwise. Obviously, over time, that's going to result in the population size growing and eventually exploding. So ultimately resulted in a larger population size over time, which then, of course, also eventually created the need for a more reliable and the ability to create a food surplus. So those are the two scenarios that are out there. I feel like number 2 has more support in the archaeological record, and it just logically makes more sense, but it's certainly possible that it happened in different ways in different regions. Do we have questions about this one? Doing all right. I'm sorry about my dog. I don't know if you can hear her or not, but I've been trying to get her to be quiet. But if you can hear my dog barking in the background, I apologize. All right. So regardless, whether it was scenario 1 or scenario 2, regardless, population pressure increased the need for a larger and more stable food resource. Okay. Whether it happened, option A or option B, we still have now a need to have a larger and more stable food resource. Okay, so we know that there's a lot of regional variation. Plant domestication occurred in at least 10 to 11 regions around the world. It began in a region that we call the Fertile Crescent. So there are a couple film clips, and just for time reasons, I'm probably going to have you guys watch these film clips on your own. I'll show you where to watch them. But there's a couple film clips that kind of paint the picture for you, paint the picture of what it looked like during this time, during this transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture. But essentially the region where it happened first is the Levant, or also known as the Fertile Crescent. The end of the Pleistocene saw intense harvesting of wheat and barley's ancestors, which interestingly enough is still what we rely upon in our modern day diet today. Even though of course we eat many other things, wheat and barley are still a big part of our diet today. We know the manipulation of plant growth cycles, or essentially the beginning of agriculture, began around 11,500 years before present. We see in the Jordan Valley, agriculture spreading across the Fertile Crescent by about 8,000 years before present. And some of these villages developed into cities. So the earliest cities are Jericho and Châtellerault. So this is, so you just can get a geographical visual representation. So the Fertile Crescent is this area in purple here. So it's called the Fertile Crescent because it's kind of shaped like a crescent roll, okay? So we see Châtellerault is right here. So that's one of the earliest cities to emerge. And then the next slides are going to show you kind of some pictures of what the earliest cities might have looked like, just so you can kind of visualize. So you're seeing that, these sedentary villages are likely supporting population sizes in the hundreds, possibly in the thousands, but especially early on, you're likely looking at, still not massive population sizes. There's probably, hundreds of people living there, not thousands. And, you can kind of visualize what I mean by all of a sudden they had to figure out what to do with both human waste and animal waste. They had to figure out how to deal with property ownership issues, and they likely all of a sudden have an increased need for leaders and an increased need for a more complex social organization. It became more and more difficult to maintain this egalitarian, nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle now that they're sedentary. They have to organize themselves much more complexly, okay, in order to avoid, the community de-escalating into chaos, essentially. As we all know, when we're talking about more humans living in one place or having to coexist in one place, rules become more necessary. That's just kind of one of the realities of living amongst people. Okay. All right, so animal domestication, starting with the dog, goes back about 15,000 years before present. So a little bit before what we're talking about with the Neolithic Revolution. The dog, at least according to evidence that we have thus far, we see evidence of dog remains being buried with humans going back as early as 15,000 years before present. And another interesting thing about animal domestication, still in modern day, only about 14 animal species have been successfully domesticated. And all of these animal species originate from Northern Africa and the Middle East. So what we know is the Fertile Crescent. So that's interesting because, especially when we go into our discussion on the origins of inequality and the Jared Diamond, gun, germs, and steel, One of his hypotheses is that some regions were what he calls geographically blessed. So by geographically blessed, he means that some regions, at least when we're talking about this original transition, some regions simply had soil that was adequate and ideal for agriculture, and also on top of that had animals that were more easily domesticated. So that film will go into, comparing domesticating cattle to trying to domesticate a zebra, for example. So if you're talking about sub-Saharan Africa, zebras have evolved to be aggressive because they're trying to survive with predators like lions and cheetahs. So they're forced to be aggressive. So what that means is that they're going to be more difficult for humans to domesticate. So, this theory, it's an interesting one. I don't know that I completely agree with Jared Diamond's theory, to be quite honest. I can agree with parts of it, but I do really want you guys to watch this documentary because I'm interested in what you guys have to say. Okay. All right. So we're kind of at a good point to stop on the lecture because I do want you guys to have some time in your breakout rooms today. So there's a couple of things I want you guys to do in your breakout rooms. So let me go ahead and pause